Hello everyone, today we talk about the Turkish Wars from the first Ottoman siege of Vienna to the Battle of Saint Gotthard. I started a mini-series to introduce the Turkish Wars as a whole. I wanted it to be just 3 chapters long and I stuck to it. Normally we would also dilute it further into more episodes as a matter of fact, but I appreciate these challenges, and this video in particular is going to be a marathon because most of 16th and 17th Turkish, and not just Habsburgic, but also, for example, Venetian warfare is to be covered. Naturally, I will stick to the most important campaigns and battles, mostly. I think that, with the exception of something like Vienna 1529, and some videos I made about Montecuccoli, about 1664, and the whereabouts, so to say, we haven't yet made a video for, and in most cases, like overwhelmingly about this time and theme in particular. Reason for which, even though this video is going to be very long, it won't cover also the many other clashes that this video wants just to be a bit like the background, the setting of for many other, hopefully, hundreds of videos on the same subject, right? So we will mostly revolve around, in fact, the main fights. Anyhow, there is a massive background internationally, politically, diplomatically, etc. that, fortunately, I must say, we have already a couple of hundred videos on overall, but we need to become a bit more evidential, right? We have already hundreds of strategy and campaigns videos, right? These are relatively new playlists, and I'm trying, especially through the specials like this one, to properly fill the gap that we have left open during the years, while otherwise discussing other important aspects of this warfare. But again, without evidential history, really, you can't understand much to begin with. So without further ado, also because there is, again, a lot of work ahead, let's start with this. So we will focus, obviously, mostly on the Ottoman-Habsburgic clashes, right? But in an Austro-Turkish sense, so to say. But again, a lot of Venetian history, also Habsburgic Spanish warfare will be covered. Today, we'll talk, for example, about Malta, Lepanto, that we still haven't covered in any meaningful way. So it's sort of pretty embarrassing to a degree. It was wanted because, again, there's always a lot to cover, but other than, for example, some Maltese Knights army organization, also battles, sieges. It's a video that I made a couple of months ago. We don't have much. So mostly we'll pivot around the Ottoman Habsburgic, Austrian Habsburgic confrontation that unfolded across the Magyar theater and adjoining borderlands between 1529 and 1664, representing as such the most sustained and intensive phase of a struggle whose roots lay in the catastrophic defeat inflicted on the medieval giant that the Kingdom of Hungary was, something more similar to the Empire of Hungary, at the Battle of Mohacs on August the 29th, 1526. Incidentally, many videos I made about Habsburgic and Ottoman Hungary will come to your aid, this if you're curious. That battle notoriously shattered the Magyar royal army, killed the childless King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, who drowned while fleeing the field. There are different accounts, but anyway. And again, we will browse only superficially these clashes that deserve instead, obviously, a video for each of them, dedicated mostly to the primary sources and an overall tactical analysis. This video is, especially this sum of, again, lots of strategical context and sort of multiple campaigns, obviously can't cover everything, like in that depth. This disaster plunged the Magyar kingdom into chaos. This was partly caused by the same Habsburgs that didn't really interfere with the Turkish invasion, right? Because they thought very opportunistically. This is a calculation also the French would make, in fact, a few years later with Vienna itself. Like, as long as our competitors, antagonists are involved, and the front line, like, let's keep them alone to take the full brunt of the Ottoman invasion in case of total defeat. We will step in later. We will see this calculation was even thought as far as England, right, as we will see with Malta now. But and it is actually very logical. There is some sort of negative bias when telling the history of the Turkish wars by saying, well, but the Christians did not unite because they didn't got one. And of course, there are lots of moral issues there, especially with the Protestants were even actively backing the Ottomans against the Habsburgs and the papacy. But in many ways, this actually shows the strength of the overall West. Like they could simply say, okay, well, there are so many different layers here that even a giant like the Ottoman can't really do much against us in a broader sense, even though these were all pretty serious issues as they were understood at the time. More of that, because I already discussed also the great fear of the Turks, so to say. There is all an anthropological conception of Western Europe that derived from the confrontation with the Ottomans. Mostly was actually a matter of Central and Southern Europeans, mostly again Germans, Poles, Italians, and also those peoples that were in part already under the Ottomans with different degrees of subdetence, so to say. All right. The ultimate result of March was notoriously also the fragmentation of Hungary into three distinct zones. Right, the Habsburg controlled Royal Hungary in the northwest under Ferdinand I, who was the brother of Emperor Charles V, and later Holy Roman Emperor himself, in fact, is with that numeral. The central and southern territories directly administered by the Ottoman Empire as Ottoman Hungary, and the Eastern Principality of Transylvania, that had been part properly of the crown, of the kingdom proper, of not even just of the crown of Hungary, functioning as an Ottoman vassal state under John Zapolya, elected rival king by Hungarian nobles in 1526. So this had favored and will keep favoring in part the same Ottoman advance against different neighbors, and who had in fact accepted on that occasion Ottoman suzerainty to secure his position. When we look at the siege of Vienna of 1529, that's again a pretty epic subject, barely less than the one of 1683, that today we will arrive just at the thresholds of in a political strategic sense. The Ottoman army on that occasion seems to have been enormous. I made an entire video in depth about the actual size, especially the combat force of Ottoman armies during this period, that essentially wouldn't surpass 50, 70,000 men, right? Some sources obviously say there were more than 100,000, etc. This doesn't matter really, we will never be able to calculate that, but by scale we know it was immense, right? And I will skip here all the many sort of strategic and logistical implications of these expeditions that we already carefully observed in many different videos. But this was a massive stretch, to say the least, for the Turks. Nevertheless, it also showed their actual power. The 1529 campaign marked this culminating moment when Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1520 to 1566, known for his military conquests and legal reforms, because in the West it's called the Magnificent, whereas in the East it's the legislator, interestingly enough, just for telling you how much the Ottoman Empire stunned the West. There's also actually an overwhelming continuation, a great deal of, not much just the Byzantine Empire, but I mean, even if you look at from a military point of view, there were lots of, not just proper ethnic Europeans, but Christians fighting for the Ottomans, as we were just noticing with the Transylvanians. And at that point, obviously, the Ottomans already ruled over much of southeastern Europe, and the Sultan chose to project Ottoman power directly against the Habsburg heartland, seeking both to resolve the Hungarian succession definitively in favor of his protege, John Zapolya, and if his circumstances permitted, to break the emerging Habsburg barrier that threatened to hold further Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. Remember, this is part of a series, so if you're interested in the previous chapter that I made about this and the creeping Ottoman advance in in this picture. The title you have to check, it will be posted in the top fix comment down below. The Habsburg Ottoman Wars, Charles V, Francis I, Suleiman, in fact, the first, and in fact, the battles, the sieges, Belgrade, Rhodes, and Moach, right? So that's already done, and that's why I make this series, just to provide with a point of reference in particular. In Madrid, Emperor Charles V, so obviously the Holy Roman Emperor on whose dominion the sun never set, because of his global possessions. He ruled from 1519 to 1556, and as such also as King of Spain, as Charles I, facing wars against France in the Protestant Reformation, found himself fully absorbed by the heretical spread and the political upheavals that the former had unleashed across Germany and the Low Countries. Also made a video about the War of the Schmalkaldic League, if you're interested in that. Unable to personally direct operations in the East, Charles, that was also not much of a typical soldier, unlike, I don't know, Francis I, for example, entrusted command at Vienna. That was objectively less important in the bigger picture than Spain, but still mostly requiring his most direct imperial authoritative attention, to his brother Ferdinand, and explicitly urged him to seek some form of understanding with Zapolya that might transform the Transylvanian claimant into an ally rather than an enemy. Right? Zapolya, however, rejected every overture and left Ferdinand isolated against the approaching Ottoman storm. With no realistic expectation of substantial outside assistance, Ferdinand was forced to rely solely on his own limited means. Whatever reinforcements could be rushed to the city, the existing local garrisons and the mercenaries, and hastily raised levies that could be gathered in the short time available. Vienna thus became the unavoidable focal point for what all parties anticipated would be the great decisive battle of the campaign. Suleiman's advance toward the city was plagued from the very beginning, however, by exceptionally heavy spring and summer rains, a phenomenon typical of the Balkan climate in that season, that in fact hovered the sort of the hinterland that the Ottomans had to cross and sustain their titanic logistical support for a siege in particular. One of the largest cities in Central Europe. Flooding turned roads into quagmires, men, horses, wagons, and above all, the heavy siege artillery, typical of sort of the Ottoman arsenal, indispensable for any serious operation against fortified walls anyway, and the Turks had experience in that from the past generation, sank deep into the mud. Many of the large caliber cannons essential for battering breaches were abandoned along the march route because they could not be extricated. This happens also in much more recent warfare, for that matter. Camels, animals unaccustomed to the cold and wet conditions of Central Europe, died in large numbers. Apparently, disease, especially dysentery and respiratory infections, spread quickly among the Janissaries during the prolonged and exhausting advance. This was really typical of the armies of the year, especially when such large forces were concentrated, even though the Ottomans were competent in their sanitary precautions. Despite these formidable obstacles, in fact, the Sultan himself refused to turn back. Right? This was probably a universal struggle. Again, I wish I could digress for each of these statements just to stress how replete in traditional meaning these holy wars really were, and how much like the international prestige and posture of these rulers was deeply tied to glorious and successful military enterprises. The Sultan sent forward his light cavalry raiders, the Akinci, to probe, harass, and demonstrate before the walls of Vienna, while the main body of the army continued its laborious progress. This was really typical of the Turks. There were all kinds, actually, even of steppe horsemen coming from God knows where. We've seen recently the Crimean Nogai raids, also in Eastern Europe, really were devastating. They often participated into the Ottoman expeditions against the Habsburgs as well. Buda, which Ferdinand had briefly captured and held, that was, as you know, the former and still like together with Pest, capital of Hungary, was placed under siege once more and retaken by Ottoman forces on that occasion. Obviously, the collapse of Hungary had been actually a pretty gradual thing, and so the Habsburgs had tried to infiltrate into that quagmire. And on that occasion, the Sultan formally restored this territory to Zapolia as his own loyal vassal, because there was always the matter of the crown of Hungary. There was basically fictitious, but still recognized by both the Habsburgs and the Ottomans as there. Like Hungary was collapsed, it was not a state anymore, but it still obviously had some interesting tools and sort of estates and groups to make leverage on against one another, exactly because it had turned de facto into a military frontier. As the vast Ottoman host drew closer to Vienna, rising obviously up the Danube, the night sky above the Austrian countryside glowed with an ominous red light, reflected from countless burning villages and farms. The deliberate scorched earth tactics employed during the advance left a trail of utter devastation behind the marching columns. Right? It's really like, I don't know, Bram Stoker, Dracula first scene kind of vibe and mood. And these are not figurative pictures. They're actually apocalyptic scenarios that literally produced in this frontier that was one of the most horrendously violent in the modern history. People scorched alive, infants impaled, people burned and cut to pieces, and from both sides, like roasted, skinned alive, all this kind of interesting quartered, flayed, so on. The Ottoman army finally reached the outskirts of Vienna late in the season, appearing before the city and the Great Apple walls between September the 27th and 29th of 1529. The defenders of Vienna had used the preceding months, obviously, to prepare the city with meticulous care. The garrison totaled approximately 20 to 20,000 men under the nominal command of Wilhelm von Roggendorf. This was an Austrian noble and overall garrison commander, but operational direction was entrusted to the 70-year-old German mercenary captain Nicholas Graf Salm. Nicholas Count of Salm, a veteran imperial commander renowned for his role at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 against France, in capturing, in fact, the same Francis I, even though there are different versions on that. We'll come back on the Italian wars somehow soon. Nicholas, wounded by a falling rock during the siege, died, however, from his injuries on May the 4th, 1530. So imagine, this is very typical of the era, like even being able to survive major pitched confrontations like the one of Pavia, that was admittedly also fought into some more closed spaces, but eventually dying more typically into a siege, right? This clash of titans. Salm had arrived leading a contingent of German Landsknecht pikemen. I recently made a video about the Landsknecht once again, because we talk a bit about their general warfare, the various campaigns. We obviously describe what their attitude was, also the siege, as we'll see now. Charles V had also contributed, obviously, 700 to 800 professional Spanish arquebusiers under Marshal Luis de Avalos, the Marquis of Pescara's successor in command of Spanish forces. These were pretty cosmopolitan noblemen. In that case, for example, if you see, had the possession in southern Italy, and whose disciplined and accurate fire would prove crucial in preventing Ottoman forces from establishing secure positions in the low-lying meadows along the Danube. Right? Naturally, pike and shot warfare, as also the Landsknecht prove, is there, but Germany is also very technologically advanced, but the actual availability of resources, we talked about this recently, it's relatively scarce, right? So even having a bit more of shot out there is somehow pretty important innovation that can sort of modulate the battle odds a bit in favor, in this case, of the Christians. Pavle Bakic, the last titular despot of Serbia, a Serbian noble exiled after Ottoman conquests and Ferdinand's ally. We recently made a video about the Ottoman-Serbian wars that also had been subjects of the Hungarians to an extent, brought 2,000 Serbian hussar cavalry to bolster the defense. Right, the Serbians will actually spread into sort of Hungary, and from there the rest of Europe, the hussar specialty eventually would be remodulated according to sort of the needs of later modern warfare. But at this point, it was also significant ethnic component from this de facto steppe area, because Hungary is the last great steppe in the west, and these are exactly the same battlefields. Vienna is basically the opening of the steppes. Queen Mary of Hungary, there was, by the way, sister of Charles V and widow of Louis II, serving as regent in Habsburg Hungary, played a central role in coordinating the dispatch of these foreign contingents as well. In order to preserve dwindling supplies and minimize the number of non-combatants consuming food, all women and children had been evacuated from the city well in advance. Every building standing outside the walls that might provide cover for attackers was systematically demolished as well. That was very important operational precaution. It's very interesting to look at the geography of Vienna today, because obviously mostly, aside from the fact that there were larger walls built later, but those were also raised, and now it's all sort of like still in the center, not quite the historical one, but it's all constructed like bears, sometimes here and there, some interesting landmarks that remind you what was there. Like you stand there at the hotel in this center, you're reminded that there was an Ottoman camp there at a point during this incident. And inside the city, new earthworks were constructed. The 4 principal gates were bricked up. A wide defensive ditch was dug, and the ancient 300-year-old walls, in places no thicker than 6 feet, were strengthened with earthen bastions and an additional inner rampart wherever necessary. So it's a good enough in which you have to just build up in emergency situations. Yes, this is the era of the Trace Italienne and of the sort of more sophisticated military engineering of the era, but most part of the world, and in Central Europe, even still in particular, by Western standards, it was a lot to update. Now, St. Stephen's Cathedral, in all its might, served as Salm's informal headquarters during the siege. Think about that when you visit the dome. The surrounding countryside had been thoroughly combed for every last store of grain, livestock, and forage. As a result, the defenders possessed ample reserves of food, powder, shot, and other necessities. Once the Ottoman army had taken up its positions around the city, Suleiman adhered to established custom by offering the defenders an opportunity to surrender before serious fighting began. These were probably the rules of war of the time. 3 richly attired Austrian prisoners were dispatched into Vienna bearing the Sultan's message to show, look, they treated them well, right? He had come only to seek out King Ferdinand after all. If the city capitulated, because this was an ad personam issue, right? This is the typical Ancien Regime mentality. This is war is an aristocratic sport. It's a matter between Suleiman and Ferdinand personally. The rest of the people just follow, right? They're not so important in the broader picture. So if the city, and there was still this idea of challenging individual combat, etc. If the city capitulated peacefully, no harm would come to its inhabitants. Otherwise, the Turk declared he would take breakfast inside the walls within 3 days. Right, which, as we will see now, would turn out to be a bit of a stretch. Salm answered by sending 3 richly dressed Islamic prisoners back to the Ottoman camp without any written reply, to show, like, look, you have the means, we have them too, for that matter. And 2 full weeks went by with no decisive achievement. Eventually, the defenders, in grim mockery, shouted back that the Sultan's promised morning meal had long since grown cold, and that he would have to make do with whatever the guns mounted on the walls chose to serve him, because evidently his breakfast was spoiled. Fighting commenced in earnest. The combination of Ottoman musketry, and because they had also a lot of firepower, they didn't have much of a stopping one, whereas the Viennese burghers were a pretty substantial representation of the European middle estate, capable, especially defending, arm in hand, their cities. They also have this exceptionally accurate shooting of the Turkish composite bowmen, coming a bit from different parts in the east, including of Europe, proved so effective, so deadly that defenders were definitely under great pressure. You could neither appear on the parapet at some point. This was also standard tactic of the siege assaults, right, where you suppress the defenders on the walls, especially when you are in substantial numerical superiority, like in this case. Consider that for a proper siege, you have to surround the entire city. That this will be a problem also in the second siege of Vienna, because the Ottomans there built no counterballation because they got soaked into these assaults, the Ottomans managed to occupy firing positions at the embrasures and also to move about inside the city without grave risk. Nevertheless, the complete absence of heavy siege artillery, that as we've seen had been largely left behind, denied the attackers any realistic prospect of creating decisive breaches. The lighter field pieces they possessed were simply incapable of inflicting serious structural damage on the fortifications. This was very important because the Ottomans were a bit experienced in fortresses storming, to say the least, and they had crafted a pretty developed almost doctrine of these assaults that is very similar to the one of the Stoßtruppen that we were talking about the other day for World War I. And so, but without cannons, it was a bit difficult with mines and assaults alone to actually succeed. Deprived of their preferred method of attack, in fact, the Ottomans had turned to mining and tunneling operations, mostly. Teams of sappers excavated galleries beneath the walls. When gunpowder charges were detonated, bridges were torn open, yet the garrison clung stubbornly to every shattered position and repulsed each successive assault with grim determination. Austrian sorties sallied out repeatedly to disrupt the Ottoman siege lines. On at least one occasion, the defenders returned to the city dragging prisoners and carrying captured equipment as trophies. Inside the walls, bands of musicians played martial airs to keep spirits high and project an image of unshaken defiance. Suleiman sought to break the defenders' will by promising immense quantities of treasure to anyone who would capitulate, but these offers fell on deaf ears. Morale inside Vienna remained remarkably high. Inside the Ottoman camp, by contrast, discipline and cohesion steadily deteriorated. Infantry units increasingly had to be driven forward into the assault under the blows of officers' sticks, whips, and drawn swords wielded by military police. As autumn deepened and the weather grew colder, the Ottoman High Command convened a formal council of war. Winter was fast approaching. Food and fodder supplies were dwindling alarmingly, and there is probably a mass of that. That does not account, however, mostly for moral issues, but definitely compounds them escalationally. Sickness, also desertion, were rising sharply as a consequence, and morale among the troops, in fact, had plummeted in particular. The prevailing view was that one final all-out assault should be attempted before the army withdrew. Suleiman personally promised substantial monetary rewards to any soldier who distinguished himself in the attack. On October the 14th, the Janissaries led the final storm. After hours of savage hand-to-hand combat fought amid the rubble of the bridges along the shattered ramparts, the assault was thrown back with enormous loss. The scale of Ottoman casualties was so great that it destroyed whatever remained of their combat cohesion and willingness to continue. The very next day, Suleiman raised the siege and ordered a foolish retreat. The withdrawal proved exceptionally difficult, by the way. Unusually heavy early snowfall at this point, combined with the deep mud already churned up during the outward march, bogged down men, horses, and the surviving pack and draft animals. It's at that point that Austrian light cavalry harried the retreating columns, taking prisoners and occasionally freeing Christian captives from Ottoman hands, although no large-scale counteroffensive was ever launched. And this is also typical, actually, of the sort of Habsburgian preparedness and general lack of resources They were pretty good in defense, but for a long time they were probably chronically short in especially the financial means to mount up significant counterattacks. Naturally, this scene changed everything in many ways. Again, I would like to digress on all the international echoes of this, of the alteration of strategic balance of great part of the war as a consequence. The Ottoman army eventually reached Buda on October the 26th, Belgrade on November the 10th, and Constantinople on December the 16th. Throughout both the advance and the retreat, Ottoman Akinci light cavalry and irregular auxiliaries carried out widespread pillaging, so undefatigable. And entire villages were put to the torch, simply put. Civilians were massacred in large numbers. Think about all the sort of the resentment of the same Turks, but also of their Christian soldiers, for that matter, on these populations. I mean, if we speak of the blacks, for example, they had never really liked the Magyars to begin with, right? So you have this incredibly crude apparently internecine, just like we're different peoples, rivalries that will continue to inflame, especially the Balkan question, even though here it's mostly Central Europe still. Captives, too, estimated by contemporary accounts at around 20,000 people, were dragged off into slavery, obviously, with Ottoman commanders reportedly showing a marked preference for young boys and girls as well as members of the clergy, for that matter. Peter Stern von Labach, an eyewitness who survived the campaign, left a harrowing record of the atrocities. Children cut alive from their mothers' wombs and impaled on pikes, as we were saying before. Young women raped to death and their bodies abandoned on the highways. Thousands of innocents murdered outright or carried away into lifelong captivity. Right. And this is actually, like, even if the writer may have exaggerated in the literature of it, surely these things did happen in a pretty large scale, and they were actually pretty dreadfully normal, especially at the outskirts of the civilized world. And these horrors left, in any case, this is important also to understand, like, not just the Turkish Wars and Mythology Hope, but a great part of modern history, like an indelible scar on the collective memory of the Austrian and Hungarian population, and were invoked for generations, in fact, afterward, as irrefutable proof of the merciless character of Ottoman warfare when conducted on Christian soil. All right. So this is a big chapter in and of itself. The siege of Vienna in 1529 constituted the first major Ottoman attempt to seize the Habsburg, let's say, capital, even though at the time it was not really a capital in the modern official sense as we understand it, but de facto, yes, it was the most important center of the German possessions of the Habsburgs in the Archduchy of Austria within the Holy Roman Empire. And you know that also for the 16th century, we definitely discussed a lot the role of the Habsburgs within the actual Roman Empire. Suleiman, remember that Suleiman was a guy who also wore tribal tiaras to parallel the Pope. One of the official titles of the Sultan of Constantinople was the one of Caesar, right? So this concepts are very important. We'll come back on them in other videos. As we've seen, the scale, like, of the troops was enormous. One of the defenders also was relatively consistent. Was, as we've seen, probably 1 to 5, even if we probably account for a maximum of 70,000 men, because in any case, also the Germans suffered there. Also, the Landsknecht at the end, like, mutinied because they hadn't been paid usually, and they said that they would have done to the Viennese what the Turks wanted to do if they hadn't been paid in time. So the situation was saved in some way. Remember, these people had sacked Rome, by the way, not just those, like also the Spaniards had sacked Rome for that matter. Now, the siege, as we've seen, lasted a few weeks, right? But it was really impressive, and this sort of tail strike of a lion roaring, trying to dismember his prey. The outcome of Vienna 1529 has since sealed the fate of Hungary for generations, actually for centuries, right? Because eventually, yes, Hungary will be reconquered will be conquered outright, if you prefer, by the Habsburgs. But there was always this, in fact, already claimed that the entirety of the crown belonged to this or that side. As we've seen, the kingdom was partitioned to Royal Hungary under Habsburg rule, Ottoman Hungary under direct administration from Constantinople, and Transylvania as an autonomous vassal principality. This arrangement essentially persisted unchanged until the early 18th century. Ferdinand's election as King of Royal Hungary at the Diet of Pozsony, essentially Bratislava, Pressburg, on October the 26th, 1526, rested also on pre-existing dynastic agreements between his family and that of Louis the Second. Of course, like, you can't dig into this, but you realize that the Ottoman intervention of 1529 had aimed first and foremost to consolidate Zapolia's position as King of Hungary in the eyes of some modern historians, obviously to also establish full Ottoman hegemony over the entire kingdom, including the western territories that were also the more developed, by the way, still held by the Habsburgs, while Vienna itself may have been viewed, in case of conquest, as a potential staging base for still deeper incursions into Europe, right? And you know that Gibbon at some point claimed that hadn't the Turks been stopped that was admittedly Vienna 1683, but in a broader sense, there could have been at some point Ottoman ships in the Thames mouth. And most people interpret that as, literally the Turks would have conquered France or whatever, but in a sense, we don't know, in terms especially of naval projection, what would have occurred had, I don't know, either Vienna or Vienna for two times, or Malta or other centers fallen into Turkish hands, right? Apprehension naturally was pretty high for different reasons. And ideally, like an empire ruling over the entire Mediterranean was definitely something that had already historically existed. But there were also some, again, specific characteristics of the West that evidently not even such a concentrated power like the Ottoman one could simply take on. And this is where you realize to the full extent how being divided, at least in formal terms, does not necessarily always mean to be less developed. And while it brings to some fragility, it does not mean that the civilization expressing all these countries is something inherently less powerful, all right? And I think that studying the Turkish wars is beautiful because it shows you this all across the board, literally, of a geographical map in interest of time and the various policies that had to cope, and also to cope with the Ottomans and to cooperate against them, all right? Now, the Ottoman army had also these logistical bases. For example, this was typically the case also back in the Byzantine era, that for these expeditions further north, the Ottomans would be mustering in Bulgaria. Everything had started in the spring. It tells you also how long the campaign, how even just to feed all that alone. Let's not even talk about the ammo or other engineering aspects. So the sheer cost of it was something that required an incredibly long participation, right? The Ottoman armies at this point, for example, in the army of 1529, comprised the elite Sipahi cavalry. These were the feudal knights, essentially, of the Turks. Many thousands of janissaries, the adoptive slave children of the Sultan, pretty apt in studying infantry warfare, for which they were also despised by the more, in fact, chivalric-minded Sipahis that sort of joked also as other Turco-Mongols about this sort of sulfur and therefore devil-stanching gunners, like fighting on foot, like lesser people. Contingents from Moldavia, and Serbians, renegades, as we've seen, loyal to Zapolia as well. These were Serbians from both sides, as well as Hungarians from both sides. Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier from 1523, a former Greek Christian slave elevated to the highest office, executed in 1536, acted as Serasker with full command authority in the Sultan's name. Speaking a bit like the chain of command, the campaign had begun formally probably in May. Suleiman had reached Osijek on August the 6th, the historic Mohacs Plain on August the 18th. This is for telling you a bit like the times and the spaces for moving these armies in general. And even to think how sort of meaningfully loaded these battlefields were Kosovo, Polia, Moach, and many others we will see now. At Moach, interestingly enough, Zapolya had formally paid homage and brought a substantial force of cavalry that accompanied the Turks for the remainder of the campaign. Right, as we've seen, like Buda fell together with other forces on September the 8th. The only river city of Bosoni offered serious resistance to the Ottoman Danube flotilla that you want to appreciate, not just if you look at the geography of Bratislava, but that is very commanding on the Danube. But the fact that this was essentially also a de facto German city, and that, or at least had an important German population, was increasingly stiffened by Habsburgic control. And so there, when things become a bit tougher infrastructurally, the Ottoman hosts that are enormous also because they're tendentially lighter in interest of individual trooper, right? So even the 1,000 German Landsknechte under Salman, the 700 to 800 elite Spanish arquebusiers commanded by captains like Juan de Salinas, Jaime Garcia de Guzman, Jorge Manrique, and Cristobal de Aranda, of whom only about 250 Spaniards ultimately survived the siege, so they were well spent in that sense, could represent a major obstacle, even for a much formidable host. This was not only because of the defensive position of the Christians. During the siege, the Spanish troops had held, for example, the critical northern sector, constructed additional palisades and trap pits. Remember, these guys had created pike and shot warfare, and also with some important field fortifications attached. Naturally, everything like the modes were pretty standard at this point, but they had also their military engineering capacities. And they were the ones who sort of shot pretty heavily against the assaulting Ottoman forces, right, preventing them from settling securely in the low-lying meadows beside the Danube ramparts, by the way. Right. As we've seen, Wilhelm von Roggendorf, speaking of hierarchy, exercised overall command over the garrison. Right. And the actions of Salm had brought to the blockade of the four main gates, reinforcing the thinnest wall sections. The Serbians of Pavle Bakic helped harassing the enemy lines for that matter. Other than just failing at the siege, Suleiman failed to force Ferdinand into open battle or to compel formal submission to Ottoman ideological superiority, which was probably from that imperial standpoint a very big deal and actually a great victory for the Habsburgs. The successful defense of Vienna fostered a significant rapprochement, by the way, between Charles V and Pope Clement VII after what had happened with the sack of Rome. In fact, directly contributed to the Pope's decision to crown Charles Holy Roman Emperor on February 24th, 1530. Right? It was very important for Christendom, and especially for powers like the papacy and the empire that at this point in history were unequivocally aligned. Right? It had been actually Clement that had sort of decided, although you can understand that also together with other international players after the Battle of Pavia to counter a bit the imperial superpower. Count Salm was, as we've seen, gravely wounded during the final Ottoman assault. He died on May 4th, 1530. Ferdinand later commissioned for him a monumental Renaissance sarcophagus, which is preserved today in the baptistry of Vienna's Votivkirche Cathedral. Ferdinand's son Maximilian II subsequently erected the castle of Neugebäude on the very spot where Suleiman was believed to have pitched his command tent during the siege. Right, this was also quite symbolic, but strategic, as you understand, because next time you quite can't do that. We have to talk a bit more about siege warfare and also these outer towers, and because at this point in history, everything is still much more composite and heterogeneous than we think. But there are some strategic principles that are very well exploitable here. Together with the two Viennese campaigns of 1529 and 1532, demonstrated the approximate logistical ceiling of Ottoman field armies operating at such great distance from their principal supply bases in the Central Balkans. You say, wait a minute, where's the 1532 campaign? And now we talk about it because, again, there are also different historiographical ways of seeing them. You can imagine, German, Austrian historiography having one name, the the Hungarians having another, the Turks, so this is why we have to go here a bit step by step, and not necessarily in a fractured way, but as you understood here, we can't cover literally everything as we would like to. The failure before Vienna in 1529 obviously did not bring an end to Suleiman's, first of all, Hungarian campaigns. Like in 1532, he advanced once more, but at that point, the Croatian captain Nikola Jurisic defending the small fortress of Gunz, Köszeg with 700, 800 men. So you have the interesting and obvious sort of blend that will remain these areas between the Slavic, the German, the Magyar terminology, held long enough, once again for autumn weather, interestingly, enough in this sort of also climatological context, to close in and hold the Ottoman host. Naturally, here we don't have to overemphasize the role of the bad season, etc. But of course, on the time it had a strain, and it was part of the equation. It is those men that will hold out a massive Ottoman force once again. Right? Charles V, now fully aware of Vienna's vulnerability, in fact, assembled a pretty large army. We're talking the tens of thousands, not several tens of thousands. Some sources will claim there were just few, but it's a significant provincial, even regional force for the theater. Rather than risk a second siege against such force that was more robust, because at this point, this is the typical situation, politics and strategy. Major shocker. Nobody thought that the Turks could come to besiege Vienna. It happens. Everybody freaks out to say, no, next time you have to be better prepared. So at this point, the Habsburgs receive some sort of support. There is a work, like there's probably a will to reinforce the defenses. And at that point, Suleiman, that had not given up, he wanted in fact to besiege Vienna once again, withdrew, laying waste to parts of southern Styria, and during the retreat, right? And you have the siege of Köszeg that also constitutes an important episode of resistance that also helped, to say the least, Charles V deflecting what could be a second siege of Vienna. In fact, you have the small fortress town called Köszeg, also known as Gunz in German. This is in western Hungary. And the Ottomans needed essentially to secure their supply lines, right? Given that they had experimented all the logistical stress in the previous campaign, and there were again just several hundred, mostly Croats, right, led by Jurisic. They had almost no artillery, just a few guns. But for telling you how medieval also this landscape looks, and the Ottoman army was pretty big. Smaller than the one of the first campaign, because there was also sort of burnout as far as everything was concerned. There may have been a rationalization of means, etc. But Suleiman marched ideally toward Vienna, but trying to secure also these various fortresses along the way with his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, and they besieged Köszeg expecting an easy victory. This was a minor place and many stronger, you can still see it today, it's a pretty small town. And many stronger forces had also surrendered without fighting. And instead, the defenders had resisted there fiercely for more than 25 days. The Ottomans bombarded the walls, launched repeated full-scale assaults, up to 19 major ones, and tried mining under the fortifications. But the garrison used counter mines and held the line without giving up. It's one of the many heroic resistances that we'll see today, and that will deserve, for this reason, a video it showed. And the siege, interestingly enough, delayed Suleiman by almost 4 weeks. Heavy August rains arrived once again, supplies became difficult. And so this is what also gave the time to Charles V to raise a large Habsburg relief army for Vienna. This was partially raised in Germany, but also in Spain once again. And so it's at this point, also because of the we'll see, the ultimate fate is actually contested at this now. Then Suleiman, having spent all this time for it, decides to withdraw, right? There is one account saying that Jurisic refused general surrender terms and forced the Ottomans to leave, and others say that the defenders accepted a symbolic nominal surrender, essentially that the Ottomans raised their flag with only a small token group allowed inside, so not a real occupation. But evidently that was a problem in any case, otherwise they would have not stood against the citadel. In either case, the Ottoman advance on Vienna was the second time ultimately stopped, right? And so the defense of Köszeg, in a broader sense, is credited with having saved the city from a second siege, as a minor engagement as it was actually turned out to be pretty big because the Ottomans broke their heads against that. And surely it played actually a very important role in the entire campaign, to say the least. In this other massive expedition, Suleiman did capture several other forts during the campaign to strengthen Ottoman control in Hungary. After the Ottomans left, Ferdinand I retook some damaged territory. In 1533, Suleiman and Ferdinand signed a peace treaty in Constantinople that recognized once again Zapolia as king of Hungary, while Ferdinand was allowed to keep the areas that he had reoccupied. But in any case, there wasn't much the Turks could do, even to force hand. And this treaty was a temporary compromise. Border fighting continued afterward, and later, after Zapolia's death in 1540, Suleiman annexed most of Hungary directly into the Ottoman Empire. In fact, this struggle continues over and over again, becomes this incredibly tormented frontier through repeated clashes and sieges that gradually hardened the landscape into a pattern of fortress warfare along the shifting frontier that encompassed also different peoples, including, again, the Slavs, mostly the Croatians, but partly also some more autonomous Serbians who were paid by the Habsburgs, by the Venetians, the Iduks, also to carry out guerrilla in the Balkan hinterland against the Ottomans. In 1541, Suleiman captured Buda after Ferdinand's failed attempt to retake it, because this tells you how long it continued, like the attempt to claim that this is the 2/3 of Hungary. Like the Ottomans technically had it, but 1/3, as we've seen, was more like a vassal, right? And it's at this point, in fact, in 1541, that the Habsburgic failure of recapturing Buda brings indirectly to the establishment of Ottoman administration over central Hungary and the creation of the Eyalet of Buda as a permanent Ottoman province. And this will sort of freeze the political administration of the frontier from the Ottoman side for a long time. 2 years later, in 1543, the Ottomans besieged and took Esztergom after a brief but intense operation, further consolidating their hold on the Danube line and securing vital communication routes. This is where I said that we have to skip the details for some of these sieges that are sort of minor but important, right, in this constellation of clashes. And by the way, the pattern intensified in 1552 when Temesvar fell after a determined Ottoman siege, securing the Banat region and opening deeper routes into Transdanubia that facilitated potential expansion north, right? And the Ottoman support to the Hungarians that were largely also Calvinistic and therefore opposed to the Habsburg Catholics, also in confession for that matter. Made lots of videos about this. These Turkish conquests were part of a broader campaign in which Ottoman forces under Hadim Ali Pasha and Kara Ahmed Pasha swept through much of western and central Hungary, in fact capturing Zsoldnok, Veszprém, and other strongholds, while Habsburg attempts to counterattack were repeatedly frustrated. The struggle reached yet another dramatic peak for many reasons. Those who know, like in 1566 before the spoiler, when Suleiman himself, in fact, led his final campaign against Szigetvar, where Nicola IV Zrinski's Croatian-Hungarian noble and band of Croatia, garrison of roughly 2,300 Croatian and Hungarian soldiers, supported by about 2,000 civilians as well, because these always contributed, obviously, to their own salvation, resisted for 33 days. Say that works don't matter when you are under an Ottoman siege, right? The Hungarians had already been steamrolled with him. They could also be Calvinistic, didn't matter anymore. But from this other side, like there were also Calvinists here and there. Everything was much complicated, but notoriously this siege brought to, as you know, the death of the same sultan. Yes, and in fact, I want to make a specific video on this. And this town resisted for 33 days against an Ottoman host that probably numbered between, again, the usual, were probably at the top of their capacity, at least for the northern frontier, some tens of thousands. Zrinski led a final sortie of 600 men that ended in his death from janissary fire on the bridge leading to the inner castle. Our epic moment, this drama. The defenders detonated the main powder magazine at that point as the Ottomans poured into the fortress, killing an estimated 3,000 attackers in the resulting explosion. The Sultan's death, deliberately concealed from the army for 48 days to preserve morale, he died just of illness and in terrifying ways, by the way, represented a profound personal and political loss that coincided with the onset of a long-term weakening of central authority in Constantinople. Right? There is to an extent, cliche that tells that the Ottoman Empire essentially started declining since the death of Suleiman at the siege of Saint Gotthard. This is in a sense true, but it's not like the Ottomans were to become less dangerous depending on the situation. On the contrary, we're still unitly able to wage war for a very long time. Consider that the empire normally was fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously, so it's really remarkable that it didn't kind of collapse before. The point is that they remained a first-class military and that they still dominated in certain particular fields. It is, however, true that overall Western warfare was more advanced already, and that things would gradually tilt in favor, probably of also a technical dominance of the West. It was never, again, technology alone is null. It's always doctrine, and it's even a bit early to talk of doctrine in strictly sort of modern theoretical terms. At this point, the Ottomans had been consistently introducing granulation of powder in their armies, etc. But when you look at the technological potentials of their lands, there's something really different there. There were lots of European instructors, contractors, especially Frenchmen, because of the impious fetus between, in fact, the Valois and the Sublime port, which, as we explained before, was also sort of a pretty cold calculation, one that made sense from the French side, and that ultimately, however, did not, in fact, save the Ottoman Empire against including the French volunteers that, regardless of their country's policy, wanted to fight and die into holy combat, like in the most appropriate elite fashion, right? As it had always been the case. This is still an age of crusades, right? The idea of modernity has polluted everything. Modernity never really existed. These were medieval systems, right? They will remain, including with the Ottoman Empire, until the beginning of the 20th century as such, all right? Different ways. Between the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 20th century, that's when the Middle Ages died. There's no modern age in between. There's just like the contemporary age afterward. Suleiman's successors proved markedly less capable. Decades of almost continuous warfare drained the treasury, even as new revenue sources were sought. Unpopular tax increases fell with crushing weight on the rural poor. This is something we've already discussed, for example, the mechanisms of Byzantine society. Not much had really changed in that sense, for that matter. And again, in terms of sort of qualitative capacity and yield output, like the West was overall more performing than the Ottoman Empire. It's power concentration that the Ottomans know how to spend to launch this sort of pretty terrifying offensive. Meanwhile, the influx of gold from Spanish colonies in the Americas drove rampant inflation across Europe. Ottoman silver depreciated sharply. Coinage was repeatedly debased, gold lost roughly half its value against goods, and silver axe, this is the Ottoman currency, were melted down and recast with large mixtures of copper, dramatically devaluating their bases. Constantinople's historic position as the western terminus of the Silk Route and a nexus of Eurasian trade steadily declined, by the way, as Western European ports, Lisbon, Seville, Antwerp, Amsterdam, boomed with commerce from the Americas and from the new sea route around Africa and the Indies. The empire's military system, once anchored by a highly professional Janissary corps, celebrated for its discipline, high morale, and tactical sophistication, fanatically loyal to the Sultan, and or at least importantly challenging the Turkish nobility, began to deteriorate as chronic fiscal pressure forcing the government to reduce costs by enlisting large numbers of peasants and other irregulars into the ranks. This is a very long-term insight, like we can't sort of understand, but again, don't think that during the 16th or even the 17th century, the Ottoman army was that bad at all, right? Things started getting bad, let's say, by the first half of the 18th century, but also, in fact, in a general sort of debacle followed to pretty hardly fought battles. And we've seen, in fact, we can't say at that point it was mostly a consequence of the 1683 failure under the siege of Vienna and the Habsburg counterattacks. We really have to resume the series on Prince Eugene because that's really crucial for the channel. The empire's population had nearly doubled during the course of the 16th century, while the amount of available arable land, however, remained essentially unchanged. Right? These are obviously sort of big estimates. We can debate them how long you want, just to eyeballing certain dynamics. As a result, however, large numbers of landless peasants roamed the countryside or crowded into cities, creating a permanent surplus of manpower that stayed increasingly channeled into irregular military formations sustained primarily by plunder taken from neighboring territories, a practice that effectively transformed military policy into institutionalized banditry on a grand scale, and obviously started to alienate further the subjects that were or had already been reluctantly brought under Ottoman control. Right? There's all a massive periphery of the empire. There's a region on its own, like even between Poland, Austria, and Constantinople. The political system underwent a parallel degradation. High offices had originally been filled by capable converts from Christianity. This had been carried out through the Devshirme. That was the same procedure from which, in fact, like the Janissaries were selected. Some kids were kidnapped naturally from foreign families, and more preferably, especially for the army, from the Balkan regions. We're talking Albania, Serbia, etc. And the strongest ones went to the army were destined to the administration as clerks, right? So initially they were drawn from humble village backgrounds. Later there was a system of also retribution whereby the same villagers gave their children, because this would remember and come back when they had sort of earned lots of privileges. We also have historians of Christian Serbians, like from the Ottoman army, tells us how he worked, because they had been Janissaries themselves. Mihailovic is one of those. We also seen him, so it's very interesting. And so the system began to lose that originary sort of expansive force that had stemmed really from different moral dynamics, mostly having to do with a Byzantine sort of attempt to escape papal control by preferring the Muslims to that, which was definitely not very rewarding on the longer run. In any case, when you look at these servants, like, realize that this man had provided a vital link between the Sultan and his poor subjects initially, and had channeled ambitious individuals into loyal service rather than rebellion. Over time, appointment, however, to high office hardened into hereditary possession, producing the inevitable consequence of nepotism, incompetence, corruption, system sclerotized once again. So again, as long as there was a viable military expansion, there was a capacity to inject new individuals, literally, and or to reward the troops and so on. On the longer run, the system began a bit to eat itself up from the within, as the Westerners were too tough of a nut to crack, as we will see now. All of these developments caused Ottoman prestige among the European powers to decline markedly. All right, at least until basically mostly the end of this chronology. At least we have to start next time with the 1683 siege of Vienna that I really made lots of videos on. But we'll continue to the early 18th century in the last episode, and we'll hopefully resume the series about Prince Eugene, so the long one with tens of chapters for each. Now, in the days of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire, as we've seen, had been feared as an apparently unstoppable superpower. And once peace, that it was really, and once peace was concluded, respected as a relatively benign ruler. There was a sense in the West that had already been expressed. Like, think about the mythologization of figures like Saladin back in the day, especially after the Holy Land had been lost. There are all plans at this point to recover Jerusalem from the West. And think again that the Knights of the Order of Saint Stephen, of the Hospitallers, didn't have things in mind, including expeditions into Palestine with support of the Druzes from the north, etc. Like, very interesting mechanism. Also because this empire was immense, and again, I can't believe we really talked so few about the Ottoman Empire and its strategic implications for the West. There was a degree of terrorism, as we've seen. Like, the Ottomans devastated the countrysides. They arrived up to Italy on different occasions from both like northeast and the heel of the boat with Otranto's siege, etc. But if you look at these mechanisms, you realize that they were even wanted by some sort of Western powers competing with one another. Treaties with the Habsburgs had been couched in deliberately condescending language, with the Turk concessions such as, quote, graciously accorded by the Sultan, ever victorious to the infidel king of Vienna. That's how they called the Holy Roman Emperor, as a matter of fact. Ever vanquished, like this kind of thing. And it's beautiful, by the way, how the Westerners kind of didn't care, right? They say, okay, well, they want to call it this way, but it doesn't change anything. That's a bit like that bombastic, arrogant Ottoman attitude that was brilliantly destroyed also by the Zaporizhian Cossacks in the famous letter directed to the Sultan. I recently made a video about also the Cossack counterattacks on the Ottoman Empire that would start like from especially the later 16th, the early 17th century. By the early years of the 17th century, such phrasing had become also untenable, however, in a diplomatic context. In fact, the long war with Austria that ended with the Treaty of Schwerpunkt in 1606 made the change explicit. The Ottomans formally acknowledged the Habsburg ruler as Kaiser, so at least emperor of some kind. It's a bit like what the Byzantines did in the West. Like, it didn't specify, obviously, the Romanity, the holiness, but still. An equal sovereign, at least a peer rather than a subordinate tributary. Customary annual tribute payments were replaced by reciprocal ceremonial gift exchanges of some sort. And so there is even a normalization of this. If you visit the Schatzkammer of Central Europe, the various armories, you find some beautiful, at times not much praise of war, but literally replicas of Ottoman armor that the German princes gifted one another because of the fascination that existed with this terrible enemy. And in many ways, the Ottomans did the same with the West. Ottoman ambassadors assumed their place among the resident diplomats of European courts, by the way. The old idea of a universal Islamic commonwealth under the Sultan's authority was quietly abandoned as well in the process, underscoring actually a weakening of the Turkish ambitions, at least, in favor of the pragmatic recognition that sovereignty in Europe would remain permanently divided, as well as the fact that there were some powers, for example, in North Africa, that preferred to side with the Christians at some point, were properly installed there at the detriment of the Ottomans. The Turks will, at some point, even with their fleets, visit the Spanish as far west, probably the Spanish coastline, to have the Moriscos rise against the Catholic, because there were still large swathes of of Muslims, or at least they should have been converted, but it was after the end of at least with the fall of Granada, they also made a video on, but the limpieza de sangre was sort of difficult to enforce, especially in a country like Spain. It was not just huge and not politically centralized and united, actually, but it was just a dynastic sum of crowns, but still had this large swathe of the population had been barely converted from the previous era. The Mudeyyars had been really consistent. So in the same Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean, as we'll see now, would slip away during the same period with the Great Siege of Malta in 1565 that saw the Ottoman Empire attempt to conquer the island headed by the Knights Hospitalier. This was the sovereign military order of Malta already at that point, because they had been relocated to the island in 1530, if you remember in the previous video, after the expulsion from Rhodes in 1522. This all under Charles V, by the way, because that land belonged to Spain, if anything. So Suleiman launched the second attempt after an earlier failure in 1551. Right, the knights, numbering around 500 together with approximately 6,000 foot soldiers, withstood the siege from May the 18th to September the 8th, 1565, and repelled the invaders. This was grueling. In many ways, the siege of Malta is one of the most epic in the history here of the Turkish Wars. Jean Parisot de Valette, after which today's capital of Malta is named, and Grand Master of the Knights from 1557 to 1568, continued aggressive raiding on non-Christian shipping, and had taken some 3,000 Islamic and Jewish slaves during his tenure. The corsair Dragut posed a major threat. In 1551, he and Sinan Pasha invaded Malta, but withdrew after days to sack Gozo and seize Tripoli. Valette ordered strengthening of Fort St. Angelo and construction of Fort St. Michael and Fort St. Elmo in 1552. Now we pass to talk about the siege of Malta proper, but this is just to give you an idea of the maritime situation, of the privateering, corsair activity from both sides, actually. That is incredibly intense and very underappreciated in the history of early modern warfare, for that matter. We have in 1560 the Battle of Djerba. This was a disaster for Christians, marking the high point of Ottoman Mediterranean domination, even though this is after Malta, and so something that you can argue had importantly represented a very important setback in Ottoman expansion. In mid-1564, Omega captured high-ranking Ottoman prisoners, giving Suleiman casus belli, right, for Malta. And Valette's spies warned of invasion. He raised troops in Italy and stockpiled supplies. So the Ottoman armada that attacked Malta was constituted by 193 vessels, including 131 galleys, and set sail on March the 22nd, 1565. Estimates of the invading force range from 28,500 to 40,000, including 6,000 Sipais, 6,000 Janissaries, and various volunteers and corsairs. Defenders totaled about 6,100, with 500 Knights Hospitalier, 400 Spanish soldiers, 800 Italians, 500 from galleys, and 3,000 Maltese. Valette harvested crops and poisoned wells before the fleet arrived on May the 18th and anchored at Marsakslok. Dispute arose between Land Commander Mustafa Pasha and Naval Commander Piyale Pasha over anchoring. Piyale preferred Marsamxet, but Mustafa insisted on reducing Fort St. Elmo first. Bombardment began in late May. Valette concentrated heavy artillery in St. Elmo to delay the enemy and await relief from Garcia Alvarez de Toledo in Sicily. What is interesting is how also the siege of Malta had been prepared by the defenders, right? And so the response was somehow important, even though resources were scarce, right? And much was owed not just to these volunteers of knights, etc., but to the same Maltese that defended their island. Constant bombardment reduced the fort to rubble within a week. Again, Ottoman technical capacity is very strong, like artillery, siege techniques. Apparently, in the same siege of Malta, but also in other instances, it seems that the Ottomans were particularly good marksmen. They had some sort of pretty long-ranged, quasi-sniping rifles, at least in a broader intent. And during the ferocious attritional combat in this, amidst this smoldering ruins, like, you have a lot of this incredibly sort of dark vibe regarding the achievements of technology of the era. Nightly evacuation and resupply of the ruins of St. Elmo continued. And this is also, in fact, a trait that you still find, like, for a long time, throughout all the age of which fortresses were. Fortresses are relevant even still today, but at this point, there was, again, still this medieval bias. Few defenders can hold out really very large amounts of troops. It's all relatively meager means. You can always defend these rubbles that are very tough terrain to advance on, by the way. Dragut arrived in May and set new batteries threatening the ferry lifeline. Janissaries seized the Ravelin and ditch on June the 3rd. Assaults on the 10th, the 15th, and 16th of June were repulsed anyway. Dragut was mortally wounded on June the 18th, arguing over cannon aim. By the way, don't expose yourself too much. On June the 23rd, the Ottomans captured ruined St. Elmo, killing over 1,500 defenders, but sparing 9 knights captured by corsairs. Turkish losses at this point reached at least 6,000. Remember, this is just the number of the Janissaries, for example, including, in fact, half of the latter, in particular the Janissary Organic. Mustafa floated decapitated knights on mock crucifixes across the bay, foretelling you how deep the sense of religious struggle really was here, how much the crescent was clashing with a cross here. Valette responded by firing, by the way, Turkish prisoners' heads from cannons. Meanwhile, during this terrific siege, panic spread in Europe. Elizabeth I, for example, was warned of the peril to Christendom if Malta fell. Also, a small relief of 600 men under Melchor de Robles landed in early July. Mustafa's double attack on Sanglia on July the 15th used 100 small vessels dragged overland, a tactic that the Ottomans had used before. Think about the same siege of Constantinople in 1453, to attack, in fact, by sea while corsairs struck by land, right? Galeas per montes. This was actually used by different armies in different contexts. A defector warned Valette, by the way, and a palisade deflected the sea assault until a hidden battery at Fort St. Angelo sank most boats with 2 salvos, drowning over 800 enemies. The Ottoman land attack failed when relief crossed a floating bridge to Fort St. Michael. Bombardment with 65 guns continued all along, and it's been estimated that as much as 130,000 cannonballs were fired, which is a marvel of logistics, by the way, for the time. A massive assault on August the 7th breached the walls, but retreated when Captain Vincenzo Anastasiou's sortie from Medina attacked the Turkish field hospital, beheading over 60 and causing panic that relief had arrived. This is incredible, and if you think about just again, we'll make a more detailed video about the siege of Malta, but there are all these incidents where you can evidently palpate the brutality of spiritual clashes and the symbols of probably the sense of revenge, the necessity of, as we've seen here, even taking revenge of the beheaded, crucified Christians, and the massacre here, the beheading of the Turks in the hospital, etc. It's really important. Assaults between the 19th and the 21st of August. By the way, Malta, in the mid of August, it's you're cooking right under armor. Apparently, the Hospitaliers had a bias towards heavier armor than the usual because this was allegedly part of their way to probably withstand for like pressure and experience the passion of Christ in these ovens. Naturally, we can't think a bit more practically, but it seems like that knightly ethos also included this kind of even anachronism that still, however, in defense, like this man covered in steel, like was really impressive and sort of capable of fencing off much more likely armed and armored opponents, right? The Janissaries also had a much more varied equipment than we think, but generally speaking, the Turks were lighter, right? Naturally, the Hospitaliers were also the picked force. We don't know too much, unfortunately, even what happened in these days. Only God knows, but not even those who took part in them probably fully knew what was really happening. And we just know that Valente vetoed at this point the retreat to Fort St. Angelo. They wanted to resist further, and this really meant a lot in moral terms because it's really a massive iron arm, right, where the stronger will prevails. Late August, attempts with Mountain Siege Tower were destroyed by the Maltese engineers with chain shot. It was used, in fact, also in normally in naval warfare, but not always in counter naval fire from the coast. Early September, so Mustafa marched from Medina to winter there, but long-range cannon fire bluffed the demoralized Turks into thinking that the poorly defended city had ample ammunition. It's a very interesting bluff, and one that tells you also how desperate the Christians defending were, but resorting actually to the right psychological means. On September the 8th, the Ottomans finally embarked artillery and withdrew. They had given up, losing perhaps a third of their force, which is insane. Combat indices widely explain that, but an army that fights to also one-third of its elements, at least, it's also a very strongly determined army, right? And here, consider the Ottomans had made the gigantic, again, strategic and logistic effort to storm. It was not to attack, at least, this incredibly fortified positions in the middle of the Mediterranean. We've seen it in Rhodes as well. We'll see it now in Candia, for that matter. They were a bit specialized in this also because they had these immense resources, but the Christian defense was superior and showing, in fact, how sort of cost-effective, beneficial the general Western way of war in the circumstances really was. The Grand Soccorso as well was called the Great Relief of about 8,000 men under Garcia Alvarez landed just the day prior, September the 7th, at St. Paul's Bay. Naturally, Mustafa, believing the relief larger even, like re-embarked, but called troops back when realizing numerical superiority. It was fighting that actually routed the Ottomans. Hot-headed knights charged without orders, forcing, for example, Ascanio della Cornia to order general pursuit, massacring the retreating force, because these commanders basically saw that their men were just wanted to kill the Turks as much, and they couldn't be stopped. So, okay, green light that, and this force from here, again, prevalently we've seen that these were Maltese, Italians, etc., but as we've seen, there are Spanish reinforcements, there are people actually coming a bit from all over Europe, because this was such a great epic fight that everybody wanted to be in it. This is a leitmotif of the Turkish Wars, as a matter of fact. Even the Protestants wanted to go fight, like maybe their father, the princes, would not obviously side, but their children, their sons, would want to prove themselves, and this will be a constant. Real casualties varied in estimate. Some said even up to 25,000 to 35,000 Turkish dead, which is a bit too much. This does not devaluate, however, the incredible mortality here. A third of the knights, by the way, and a third of Malta's inhabitants were lost. Many Maltese had also escaped, even though they didn't have many means to get out of there. It wasn't even up to fairly late in time, much of a relief attempt or support because of different political international reasons. Towns like Birgo and Saint-Glair were leveled, right? Valet's leadership, however, stood etched probably in the firmament of great commanders, united Europe, paving the way, as we'll see now, for Lepanto 6 years later only, right? And that would be a massive title shift. Every person who says that Lepanto did not have strategic consequences should be hanged, in my opinion. As we'll see now after Lepanto, the Ottomans would never think of the Mediterranean ever the same way, ever. Right? The Christians got the upper hand, and a great deal started go further downhill from there, regardless of things like Candia that also led the Ottomans white in spite of the final victory. Besides, when you have this massive, we've seen it before with Vienna, you have this massive Christian victories, you realize that everybody wants to now invest into that side. I mean, from one side, yes, there is a rebalance of power, like the opponents of the winners would sort of be more felt, but at the same time, it was a general enthusiasm that stemmed from a genuinely Christian background, regardless, again, of confessional clashes that are very much at the peak at this point in many ways. Valet built fortified Valletta, in fact, on Mount Sciberras to deny the position to future enemies. He died in a hunting accident. It was really common among noblemen in 1568. Right? The Battle of Lepanto that we just mentioned. Again, Lepanto deserves 64 hours long battle analysis, whatever, but we will probably, again, reduce it to two and a half, you may never know, or different parts. Lepanto was fought, as you know, on October the 7th, 1571. It saw the Holy League, so the coalition led by Venice, Spain, and the Papal States under Don John of Austria, the legitimate half-brother of Philip II of Spain, would be killed by his half-brother, by the way. A very interesting relation among the, at this point, Spanish. Well, okay, they were just the following generation after Charles V, who were still relatively international. In fact, coming from different backgrounds. Inflicting a major, to say the least, defeat on the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras. Right? This is close to Actium as well. And so there were different battles were fought around there at the entrance of the Gulf of Corinth, essentially. So, very strategic place. The last major engagement fought almost entirely by rowing vessels in history, by the way. It involved over 450 warships. I made some videos about galley warfare during the Renaissance, by the way, aside from the one of the previous millennia. And it really marked the largest naval battle in Western history since antiquity. You want to appreciate, in a time, by the way, in which everybody was a bit fixated with recovering an ideal classical past in terms of imitation of the Greeks, the Romans, even though actually here the system was already more advanced. Now, the Holy League formed to rescue Venetian Cyprus after the fall of Nicosia and Famagusta in 1570, 1571. Right? That is also a pretty bloody page here. We can actually briefly talk about it. You know what occurred, and also the fate of Marcantonio Bragadin, as a matter of fact, was flayed alive when captured by the Turks, just for saying, again, what... This is also crazy, say, the extreme that of the swings between sort of chivalric courtesy and peaceful coexistence, cultural intersections, and pure hatred, cruelty, brutality, massacres, and so on. Like the siege of Famagusta in particular, like this took place from September 1570 to August 1571 during the Ottoman Venetian War 70-73. So it overlaps with these events. It was the final major stand in the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus that had been under Venetian control since 1489. Remember, roads had also fallen, so the Venetians in the hospital areas had mostly been the major sort of naval powers around, especially ever since Genoa had been ousted by the Ottomans from the Black Sea. And Cyprus was naturally isolated far from Venice and surrounded by Ottoman territory at this point. So Venetian defenses had been strengthened in the 1560s, but the island's population, mostly Orthodox Greeks, resented Venetian Catholic rule, heavy taxes and oppression, making local support untenable. Spain, the main potential ally that was, however, not particularly involved, at least in Eastern Mediterranean affairs, was busy, in fact, with other wars and could not help. Like the Ottomans, under Sultan Selim II, launched a large invasion in summer 1570 with 80,000 to 150,000 troops and hundreds of ships to seize the island. And they quickly overran most of Cyprus, including a brutal sack of the capital Nicosia, where tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. By mid-September 1570, Ottoman forces under Commander Lala Mustafa Pasha reached Famagusta, the last major Venetian stronghold on the east coast. And the Venetian garrisons, commanded by Marcantonio Bragadin, was the civil governor, along with military leaders like Astore Baglioni and Lorenzo Tiepolo, numbered around 7,000 to 8,500 men, including locals and mercenaries, with about 90 cannons. They faced a much larger Ottoman army, right? Estimates are obviously always a bit exaggerated, but this was a massive expedition of at least some tens of thousands of men, with apparently more than 145 guns, plus the naval blockade. The Battle of Lepanto is fought in a context where you have like a deep commitment to the Ottomans elsewhere as well. The defenders held out heroically for nearly 11 months, for longer than expected, despite relentless Ottoman bombardment, mining under the walls with earth ramps built to reach the fortifications, and repeated assaults. Supplies, gunpowder, and food ran critically low. The garrison was reduced to a few hundred effective fighters by the end, many wounded or starving. Ottoman casualties were heavy. Contemporary accounts claim around 50,000 plus dead from assaults and disease, although they likely exaggerate, obviously, because there weren't all those people, by the way, and to die also like that. The prolonged resistance died down Ottoman resources, however, in both time for the Christian states from the Holy League, which later won the Battle of Lepanto, big spoiler, but with no relief from Venice, because help was delayed or withheld, possibly considered, again, there was the entire Ottoman fleet also operating, again, as far as Lepanto, so how do you cross, right? And possibly also to preserve the forces, not just for the upcoming naval clash at Lepanto, but literally to get there and finish the fight. Bragadin negotiated surrender on August the 1st, 1571, and terms were agreed: safe passage for Venetians to create protection for locals and no massacre. Evacuation began peacefully for 3 days, but during the formal handover on August the 5th, tensions erupted. Mustafa accused Bragadin of mistreating and killing Islamic prisoners or hiding munitions, claims that surfaced or were used as pretext, and Mustafa mutilated Bragadin, cutting off ears and nose, executed other leaders like Baglioni, and ordered a massacre of remaining Christians in the city. It was really unchivalrous and shameful. And in any case, however it went, like it signals the sheer level of hatred and resentment. I mean, these guys had held for almost a year alone, isolated from any possible support. Can you imagine that? What it means for those men to have gone through that? Bragadin was specifically imprisoned, tortured for about 2 weeks, then publicly flayed alive in the main square while still conscious. He died during the process, reportedly praying. Remember that. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his insignia, paraded mockingly, including on an animal, through the streets, and sent as a trophy to Constantinople for Sultan Selim II. These are the sort of the happy, cultural, practices of the Turks. The brutal treatment naturally shocked Europe, but as we will see now, with the turned Bragadin into a martyr symbol and fueled Venetian Christian resolve at Lepanto. where in fact Venetian sailors, as we'll see now, fought especially fiercely. Cyprus remained Ottoman afterward, but let's say that there is an enormous deal here of Venetian tales of heroism that, as we'll see, that will not end here. But back to the Christian fleet. Members of the Holy League included, as we've seen, Venice with 109 galleys and 6 galleasses. They were the monsters of the monster and galleys of the seas at that point. Spain with 49 galleys. Genoa with 27. The Papal States with 7. Tuscany, Savoy, Knights of Malta, and others. The total was 206 galleys and 6 galleasses, manned by 40,000 sailors/horsemen and 30,000 troops, including 7,000 Spanish regulars, 7,000 Germans, 6,000 Italian mercenaries, 5,000 Venetians, and many Greeks. Horsemen were largely free Greeks on Venetian ships, convicts elsewhere. Right, you know that the Turkish Wars bring back slavery among the horsemen, right? They were often prisoners of war in that character, because normally also in antiquity, like, horsemen were actually pretty good, had pretty good living conditions. They were well fed, well paid, like they had to be treated very well, even just physically, for the ships to be performing. And it's interesting to see this military galley tradition. It obviously lives on. It's still very competitive, also in more sort of northern waters at some point, up to fairly late in time, right? The Ottomans instead put at sea 222 galleys and 56 galleots under Ali Pasha, with 37,000 slave horsemen and 25,000 soldiers, plus North African allies. Skilled sailors, but fewer elite janissaries, for that matter. The Christians held superiority in guns. That is very interesting. 1,815 versus 750. And arquebusiers/musketeers against Ottoman composite bows. These battles were very similar to the land ones, also because they were all mostly about boarding. You had these guns, the swept, sort of the stars from the galleasses, the enemy decks, etc. So it's very brutal, beautiful battle. Cervantes participated to this battle. It's enormous. Lepanto is something beyond any human belief, astronomically, cosmically speak. Now, the fleets met on October the 7th, after Christians sailed from Messina on September the 16th, and the Ottomans from Lepanto itself. Naturally, here the names also of Greece are in Italian, because the Italians eventually also, as we've seen in the videos about the Moran War, but it was controlled, in any case, the Mediterranean. Italian was the Mediterranean language for everybody involved at sea here. And in fact, the Lepanto fleet was essentially an Italian armada. I also made a video about the Spanish Armada that, as you've seen, got lots of ships from southern Italy in that case as well, and including galleys, by the way, in the northern waters, etc. We will talk more about that because we have a big series there going on as well. The battle is quite... it's not overly complex, telling the truth, because especially the larger engagements can't be. They tend to be fairly simple, but the battle deserves a much better explanation. In any case, wind initially favored the Turks, but they shifted at noon. 6 Venetian galleasses in front disrupted Ottoman array with close fire range. Again, they shot from the turrets with mitraille, and then they would be boarding with hand grenades and double-handed swords, like to sweep the decks. So it was as brutal as you can imagine, and beautiful there. And the contact began with Barbarigo's left wing and Sirocco's right. Melee ensued, just like in 2 big battle lines, like in terrestrial battles, right? And both leaders were killed there, they freed the Christian slaves as well in the process, by that joined the fight, and this bath of blood. So there is a sense of redemption, a sense of sun and an abyss, right, and of light and darkness. It's very metaphysically judging eventually the outcome of the clash. The center clash saw Ali Pasha ramming John of Austria's Real. Hand-to-hand fighting involved the Spanish Tercio and the Janissaries. Colonna's counterattack captured the Ottoman flagship, killed Ali Pasha, and hoisted the Holy League banner. Right, the Christian admiral ship was made of Sardinians. Apparently, had a great role in that sense in that battle. And this, like the rising of the cross, like broke the Ottoman morale nearby, together with the deaths of their commander. Doria's right wing sailed south, opening a gap. These were the Genoese. Ulug's Ali attacked the southern flank, nearly breaking the center, but Bazan's reserve forced the Turkish retreat. Right, isolated fighting continued until evening. It was essentially mopping up operations. Was really normal in this context. Some Janissaries fought to the last, by the way, throwing oranges when weapons ran out, which seems sort of appropriate in the situation in some inexplicable way. But yeah, I mean, that also, where do you go? Where they knew what fate would await them there. The Christians ended up capturing 117 galleys, which was an astronomically traumatic asset. Like, the Ottomans rushed to rebuild another fleet from scratch. It was eventually never used because the Christians decided for different reasons not to simply press on Constantinople. They could have been captured at that point, and those Turkish vessels were eventually left to rot in the various ports of the Levant unused. But it's just for saying how deeply the Turks freaked out. The Christians sank or destroyed 83 enemy vessels, took 10,000 prisoners, rescued thousands of slaves, and they lost about 7,500, 10,000 dead. Apparently, this may be slightly inflated numbers, but still it was an incredibly brutal fight, and the Ottomans allegedly lost 30,000 to 40,000. Right? Probably it was more contained, but the battle is as big as it sounds by scale. And it's utterly insane that it even happened, historically speaking. Unfortunately, I can't digress on the sort of various political and strategic implications. It was a Roman triumph held in the comeback of the army to the Pope with Colonna, with these heroes, right? The various admirals, John of Austria, etc. But I can't stress enough the moral shock that the Turks underwent. Like, people think that some people, at least unfortunately, think that strategic consequences are merely whether you seize a piece of land or not after a battle. And this is absolutely not what strategic consequences are. I mean, it's just probably the fact that the Ottomans never dared to venture as far west against the Christians, even though they had the option to, and they never saw those waters safe to sort of launch attacks, like possible sieges. Again, it's that close to Malta, right, in time. Anymore, it's a major watershed, right? Too bad the Christians didn't press on, because they definitely had the chance to take over Constantinople. That would have been really epic. But again, that's why we need an entire series, perhaps, on Lepanto would be adequate. Definitely, the victory halted Ottoman encroachment on Italian territories and confirmed Mediterranean division: eastern half Ottoman, western Spanish, and Italian. The Ottomans rebuilt, as we were saying, more than 150 galleys in 6 months only as a response, but they would basically just be yet another massive asset wasted. They feared that those would have been used to defend the Bosphorus from a Christian attack. So-called Mehmed Pasha boasted Cyprus, the loss of Cyprus had deprived Venice of an arm, while Lepanto merely shaved their beard, right? But the reality was a bit more complicated indeed, and just for the fact that we're talking about Venice was objectively a superpower, and the naval force here was significantly hit after the loss of Cyprus, but at least the potential range and strategic bases and projection. But in general, the general effort, right, of Venice alone, right, was something that the Ottomans could barely contain. After all, this Venice ceded Cyprus officially. It paid even an indemnity in 1573 peace, which was a tribute, as we've seen also the Habsburgs were doing that to keep the Ottomans quiet, not to have privateers roam to harass the same trade that between these ferocious fights that normally resumed between Constantinople and Venice, by the way. There were lots of intersections there. But there is no doubt that the battle boosted Christian confidence after decades of Ottoman terror in a very special sense. You even have paintings everywhere. There are so many monuments to victory in the beautiful Baroque churches of the era scattered all over Europe. Catholic Europe. You have paintings of the Virgin throwing rosary beads on the Ottoman fleet from heaven that are actually turning into grenade, explosives. So it's beautiful, really. Now, the struggle on land, however, just to come back on a relatively less humid place, given the locations, intensified again in the 1590s with the outbreak of the so-called Long War, also known as the 13 Years' War, 15 Years' War, 1593-1606, depending on how you count it. A brutal, grinding, multi-front clash that became one, in fact, of the longest, most resource-draining and strategically consequential confrontations in the entire Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry. This war erupted directly from the spectacular Habsburg victory of the Battle of Köszeg on June the 22nd, 1593. This was actually a relatively small-scale engagement. At some point we will see it better, but its shockwaves reached Constantinople and fundamentally altered perceptions of Ottoman invincibility on the northwestern frontier. Between 1591 and 1593, Teli Hasan Pasha, the fiercely ambitious and aggressive Beylerbey of Bosnia, launched 3 successive campaigns to seize the fortress of Köszeg, a heavily fortified Habsburg stronghold strategically positioned at the confluence of the Sava and Kupa rivers in central Croatia. The capture of Bihać in 1592 had eliminated the last major defensive barrier before Zagreb, that is obviously Croatia's political, ecclesiastical, and cultural center already at that time, from the Middle Ages, really, leaving Köszeg as the sole remaining obstacle blocking Ottoman access to the Croatian interior and threatening the entire Habsburg military frontier system as a whole. Because these were essentially militarized frontier colonies, right? There were lots of refugees from Serbia as well. There is the Krajina, probably in the Slavic language, of the many Krajinas that also give the name to the entire country. Meaning properly frontier, right? And the Styria, Carniola are just next door, and in general, the Habsburgs don't have much money to simply campaign there, so they subsidize this local militias that mostly hold Ottoman raids and the ones of their sort of weird allies from the steppes. Now, in reaction to escalating border raids, widespread pillaging by Ottoman Akinci light cavalry as usual, and the mounting existential danger to Croatian lands, Pope Clement VIII issued passionate calls for a Christian league to resist the Ottoman advance, while the Croatian Sabor, that is the parliament, responded by mobilizing resources, raising taxes. Obviously, if those people will think that, but wars cost money, here we have the genius that we will put in charge of the situation, and recruiting roughly 5,000 professional soldiers in anticipation of the next assault. So always, again, provincial forces that have to withstand this major Ottoman offensives, larger in number and sort of very threatening in scope. On June the 15th, 1593, Hasan Pasha crossed the Kupa River at the head of an army numbering between 12 and 16,000 troops drawn from the Sanjaks of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Klis, Lika, Zvornik, Pojega, and Cernik. He immediately invested Köszeg, subjecting the fortress to intense artillery fire and repeated infantry assaults. As always, as you understand here. The garrison, numbering only about 800 men, was commanded by two Croatian priests from the Diocese of Zagreb, Blaž Đurak and Matija Fintić, who, despite their clerical background, displayed extraordinary leadership, or perhaps even because of that, in fact, indeed, religious fervor and tactical acumen, inspiring fanatical resistance among the defenders. These people deeply felt what it meant to be Catholic. For a full week, the garrison repelled every Ottoman attempt to breach the walls, inflicting unexpectedly heavy casualties, despite being heavily outnumbered and subjected to continuous cannonading. A Habsburg relief force was rapidly assembled at this point because it was an effective threat from inner Austria, the same sort of other parts of Croatia, and neighboring territories, arriving in the vicinity of the engagement on June the 21st under the supreme command of the Styrian general Ruprecht von Eggenberg. The Croatian contingent was led personally by Ban Tamas Erdodi, while Andreas von Auersperg, celebrated across the region as the Carniolan Achilles for his martial prowess, brought disciplined troops, in fact, from Carniola and Carinthia. The combined relief army totaled between 4,000 and 6,000 men, predominantly Croatian, but reinforced by German and Austrian infantry and cavalry units, including contingents of arquebusiers and light horse. As we've seen before, cavalry warfare for this frontier is particularly suited, right in the steppe, or at least in areas where you will find a lot of horsemen from, especially like this steppe and the Ottoman military tradition, and many Central Europeans adapt to that, including the Poles, as you know, quite doctrinally at that point, even in their army. Now, on the morning of June the 22nd, between 11 and noon, Erdodi launched this crashing surprise assault on the Ottoman siege positions. At that same instant, the Sisak garrison executed a fierce sortie to link up with the relief column. This is really typical, tactically wise, to catch the enemy between two fires. And it doesn't matter how small the salient party really is. What matters is that the enemy army has now, in part, like, of course, there are troops outside the fortifications, but you don't know how much they can hold. But most of the Ottoman force has to turn against the relief one. In fact, the Ottoman army suddenly caught in a lethal pincer movement between the attacking relief force and the Salin garrison disintegrated into panic. Large numbers of soldiers were driven into the Kupa River in complete disorder, many drowned attempting to swim across the swollen current, while others were slaughtered in the brutal close quarters fighting along the banks. Telia San Pasha himself fell in the chaos, killed either by musket fire into hand-to-hand combat along with the majority of his senior commanders, including Sultanzade Mehmed Bey of Herzegovina, Jafer Bey of Pakrak, Cernica Hasan Pasha's brother, Arnat Memi Bey of Zvornik, and Ramazan Bey of Bojega. The Ottoman losses reach approximately 8,000 men killed, drowned, or captured, while Christian casualties remain extraordinarily light, estimated at only 14, 15 Auersperg's contingent alone, with similarly minimal losses across the rest of the relief army. Right, and as we were saying before, again, this is essentially a provincial clash. It's nothing compared to what we just listed at Malta. Lepanto compares, but with the two sieges of Vienna for these specific lands that are very continental, obviously. But I mean, this victory sent shockwaves through the Ottoman court, although Hasan Pasha had acted largely on his own initiative, because this was also in the universal mindset of the sultans, a way to sort of try things, but sort of not to go at war fully, because it's just like you're in control of many other countries or ruled by sultan governors, etc. But in that instance, for example, the central port had a desire to maintain the existing truce with the Habsburg. So sometimes it was difficult to control provincial governors as well from Constantinople, but it was also, okay, let's make them do it and see what happens. If we win, it's better. Otherwise, we will save face, right? Especially considering what had happened to Suleiman, that had died, who was, sort of showed all made up as a corpse, like coming back to like not to spread the voice that the Sultan had dead, because as you know, then a ferocious competition for the throne of Constantinople would have been unleashed. It's normally happened in those circumstances. In particular, at this point, Sultan Murad III viewed the defeat as an intolerable humiliation to Ottoman prestige and military honor. So much so that he declared open war on Emperor Rudolf II later that year, formally unleashing the Long War. So this war then would devastate, because of its cruelty, its length, Hungary, Croatia, Transylvania, and the Balkans for over 13 years, exhausting both empires financially and militarily, and permanently altering the balance along the frontier. Right? The Long War produced a succession of major battles and sieges that revealed both the tenacity and the fragility of the two empires, but that's also part of the reason why they wouldn't fight throughout a great part of the later decades. Like from one side, you have the 30 Years' War breaking out, then the Ottomans are also going to be involved with Persia. One of the most celebrated and tactically brilliant engagements was the Battle of Kalugareni on August the 23rd, 1595. Michael the Brave, Prince of Wallachia, who in this remarkable period achieved the extraordinary feat of briefly unifying Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania under his personal rule, so a pan kind of mostly Wallachian territory with lots of minorities in between, commanded approximately 15,000 Wallachian troops supported by Transylvanian detachments and Köszeg mercenaries. He confronted much larger Ottoman army of 30 to 40,000 men, led by the Grand Vizier Sinan Pasha, on deliberately chosen difficult marshy terrain near the confluence of the Neailov and Kalnistea rivers. The battle unfolded in three distinct and intensely fought phases. In the opening one, Michael's well-placed artillery and disciplined infantry repulsed repeated Ottoman frontal assaults across the narrow river crossings, inflicting severe casualties and disrupting Sinan Pasha's initial momentum. It's very interesting. Yeah, a Wallachian force could be sort of tougher frontally than the Ottomans. This was normal, like by Western standards, and you realize that overall these other Central Eastern European powers are sort of toughening up, right? There is historically a trail like across the Sudeten up to the Carpathians of probably of Germanization. This is not much the case, but just for saying, Vienna is not that far away, right? And in the second phase, you have the Ottoman flanking maneuvers led by experienced commanders on both wings that are combined with sheer numerical superiority, forcing a Wallachian tactical withdrawal. That's what the Ottomans were good at. Mobility, enveloping maneuvers, swarms of lighter cavalry, and so on. Though Michael managed to preserve the core of his army. However, you have this final and decisive third phase in which Michael launched a powerful counterattack, exploiting the swampy ground that severely restricted Ottoman mobility and cavalry effectiveness after all. His own flanking cavalry, and there you have, in fact, also some interesting flavored tradition, and concentrated artillery fire, however, routed large sections of the Ottoman army. Obviously, infantry is also quite key to this, but this combined armed tactics inflict devastating losses. There is, in the end of all this, still Michael's eventual orderly retreat under cover of the night to preserve his remaining forces. So this is a so-so thing, and this happens in different battles where you can't properly fully annihilate the enemy. Sinan Pasha subsequently occupied Bucharest and Targoviste, constructing temporary castles in both cities to secure his gains. But his campaign collapsed catastrophically in October when Wallachian forces destroyed his vital Danube bridge at Giurgiu. The resulting panic and chaos caused massive Ottoman losses. At this point, they really come. Thousands drowned or were slaughtered during the disorganized retreat, and forced the complete abandonment of the Wallachian offensive, marking one of the most humiliating and strategically damaging setbacks the Ottomans suffered during the Long War. Another major battle took place at Kerestes, also known as Mezzo-Kerestes or Azova, between the October 24th and 26th of 1596. The early clashes, Sultan Mehmed III personally led the Ottoman army in this campaign, one of the rare instances in this period when an Ottoman sultan still commanded directly in the field. This was gradually changing also for the West, but the Ottomans had sort of distanced a bit more for different reasons, also political imagery and objective security, because again, their power was much more concentrated, right? If a sultan died in battle, that was a much greater fallout than, say, I don't know, King of France died, right? Even though it could happen, it would happen. This is a decision from the Turkish side that, by the way, underscores the personal importance that Mehmed attached to reversing recent setbacks. The Ottomans confronted a combined Habsburg Transylvanian army of approximately, it's difficult to say, they were really numerous, so they were in the tens of thousands. It was a coalition force under Archduke Maximilian III and Prince Sigismund Báthory. After capturing Eger earlier in the campaign, the Ottomans faced a strongly entrenched Christian position on the plains near Mezzo-Kerestes. Initial Ottoman assaults on October the 24th and the 25th were repulsed with heavy casualties. You see, there is always some sort of similar pattern. The Westerners are tougher, but they're inferior in number. They set up a defense, and the Ottomans try to dislodge them, and they failed the first assault. On October the 26th, Christian troops briefly overran parts of the Ottoman camp and began widespread plundering, seeming to have turned the battle decisively in their favor. But mistake, because you should know better from the annals of military history what happens, but you may not know at that point what kind of force lays outside, by the way. You should always maintain discipline, cohesion in open field and see what happens eventually. In fact, Ottoman non-combatants, camp followers, grooms, cooks, and hastily rallied units repelled the looters in a chaotic but surprisingly effective counteraction. We'll never fully know what happened. It's not like we have this capacity to know in this Hungarian context. And at the end of the 16th century, what the battle went really like. Probably there was, again, an effective rally of some certain troops, and others that had remained outside. Maybe it was a reserve. We will never know. This moment of respite allowed, by the way, in fact, still intact Ottoman artillery and cavalry to execute a devastating outflanking maneuver across the Christian lines that had remained. The Habsburg Transylvanian army was thus routed. Losses reached tens of thousands, allegedly on their side, while the Ottoman casualties apparently also were of the same scale, which tells you, however, it was a pretty hardly fought battle with, again, different battles that had crushed one another, probably a grueling clash. Maybe figures are inflated for both sides, but in general, it was pretty bloody for the times and the places. Although the victory greatly enhanced Mehmed III's personal prestige, earning him the conqueror of Egri, that is Eger, it also exposed serious internal weaknesses, widespread Sipahi absenteeism in the army, for example, also probably the fall in trust from the feudal, from the Timariot military, and the outbreak of the Chelai rebellions in Anatolia, both driven by unpaid salaries, brutal discipline, logistical exhaustion, and the cumulative strains of prolonged campaigning far from home, painted a very grim picture of the state of the Ottoman military in general, and the need of a broader reform, and also sort of acquisition of new lands to adequately reward the soldiers that are in this northern frontier is pretty bloody. It's pretty unappealing, right? There is much more elsewhere, in a sense, or at least, right? This seems to toughen a nut to crack. Ottoman defensive resilience was, however, demonstrated at the 61 siege of Candia, Tiraki Hasan Pasha, commanding only about 7,000 troops inside the walls, successfully held this strategically crucial fortress captured by the Ottomans the previous year, only against a much larger Habsburg coalition army. The prolonged and highly skillful defense inflicted severe casualties on besiegers, preserved Ottoman control over this vital position in western Hungary, so on the heart of the frontier with the Catholics, and denied the Habsburgs a major breakthrough during the long war's later stages. Here there is a massive pause, right? There is obviously continuous skirmishing across the frontier. Here we're making, for the sake of the introduction, much sort of shorter video and sort of skipping different engagements, sieges, etc. It's a very interesting and, as you understand, also kind of underrated sort of chapter in the history of modern European warfare, because you say, but all these battles, like, important, how often do they recur? Really almost never in sort of in pop culture. At least you sound these names, aside from how I butchered them, you should at least know, and I'm sure that many of you actually know some of them. But you have, as we said before, because of different international alignments, the Holy Roman and Ottoman empires leaving each other alone relatively. The Venetians also are, as we will see now, invested. That is one of the most heroic, as bloody and really extenuating chapters in military history, and this really deserves a series, not even just a video on its own. This is the Siege of Candia, now Heraklion, the same capital of Crete. And this is part of the reason, if you wonder what was going on with the Venetians, why the Ottomans were involved elsewhere, and the Germans were also here throughout the 30 Years' War and beyond, is, albeit mostly at the end of the 30 Years' War, this at least the longest phase of the Cretan War between 1645 and 1669. This siege was lasting decades, right? But this was fought notoriously between the Republic of Venice and the Ottoman Empire. 21 years, right? It ranks as one of the longest sieges in recorded history, and one of staggering resistance from the side of the defenders. Again, it's reductive to speak of heroism for the Venetians here. Essentially, there are different sort of paths to this, considering Mediterranean Christians and Muslims keep fighting one another. The Christians raid a lot, right? Muslims as well. In 1644, the Knights of Malta attacked an Ottoman convoy carrying pilgrims and officials, landing loot including high-ranking figures in Candia. And the Ottomans used this as a pretext to invade Crete. In 1645, with around 60,000 troops under Yusuf Pasha. This is consistent, again, with the scale and of Ottoman regional involvement, except this turned into a quagmire. So they quickly captured Chania, Lacania, and Retimo after 2-month siege each, then overrun most of the island by 1648, leaving Candia as the last major Venetian stronghold that sacked there at that point the Turks into one of the greatest bloodlettings in the history of mankind. I mean, the Ottoman Empire had to stop even paying the alms to as one of the sacred duties of Islam to the orphans, to widows, because of the sheer costs of the war. I mean, this is the moment in which Italy basically ceases being a superpower, and with the decline of Venice, that is also probably exhausted by this. There are, as we will see, we have already seen in different videos, like, again, the Morean War, Venetian coming back, but it's never sort of in the bigger picture for how powerful Venice had been up to this point, and also the Ottoman Empire in many ways. And in fact, also the later siege of Vienna, other attacks, as we'll see now, to the Habsburgs, started as a sort of changing page for the Ottomans after the siege. The Ottoman forces besieged Candia starting from 1648, cutting off war supplies and blockading sea routes while bombarding the city's strong fortifications for years with limited success. Consider that military engineering had been developing, right? We're almost to the era of Vauban. The Venetians, have sort of pretty solid sort of defensive capacities in all a secular history of this kind of coastal defenses, island defenses as well. The Venetians are led for much of the time by the epic Francesco Morosini, who became a key figure defending stubbornly the city through naval blockades of the Dardanelles as well. Right, this counter strikes of the Venetians, and it's a beautiful era in which you have these guys in lace and parade looked that past like at the rolling of the drum under the Ottoman batteries on the Bosphorus. Right, there is the famous Ottoman cannon still preserved in Britain that tells you also, how monstrous, like, the entire Ottoman military infrastructure really was, and sort of here these Italians defiant of any of this stress, like showing them if they wanted, even if they were under siege, they could cross the Bosphorus. And, it's beautiful, the Dardanelles action, and the Dardanelles guns. In fact, that's what I was talking about regarding the monster bomber of the Turks. There are mixed results, by the way. There are lots of amphibious operations. The Venetian Navy harasses the Ottomans. There are victories in 1655-56, a defeat in 57. There is at this point an aid from European allies, especially after 1659, and heroic resistance despite heavy mining warfare, assault, and attrition. Most importantly, the Ottomans suffered enormous losses, tens of thousands dead from combat, disease, and failed attacks. They persisted anyway. Venice received sporadic help from states like France, the Knights of Malta, and others, but relief efforts often failed. For example, the 1669 famous French expedition under François de Beaufort ended in disaster with the explosion of their flagship La Thérèse and withdrawal. You have these cocky young aristocrats that are actually Louis XIV allowed this French nobleman to go there and fight, even though France was technically friendly in a covert alliance with the Turk. Later, he would have to stop in Vienna. He wouldn't send anyone, but to comfort the Ottomans, so to say. But these guys arrived in all these great uniforms. They attacked head on, and they got all massacred. It was sort of incredible. Like the sheer level of bravery and fanatism on this battlefield. It's something from the Westerners and their chivalric mindset. It's incredible, right? Apparently, a Venetian defector in 1667 provided Ottoman engineers with info on peak points in the walls. By mid-1669, in any case, with supplies exhausted, morale broken, and only about 3,600 fit defenders left, Morosini surrendered on September the 27th to Grand Vizier Ahmed Koprulu without full Senate approval back in Venice, making him, in fact, even a controversial figure for that matter. And there were some sort of agreements. Christians were allowed to leave with possessions. The Turks didn't want to press on sort of the brutality because they were exhausted and they were just finally glad this was all over. Venice kept small fortified islands, offshoots like Ramvusa, Suda, and Spinalonga for naval use, and gained some territory in Dalmatia as a compensation even. Crete became fully Ottoman, though. At the same time, the siege's massive cost weakened the empire and contributed to later declines in a big structural sense. So this can't properly be denied. There is obviously some broader European context, but now we don't have time to simply discuss it. There is, if anything, this last parallel event in the continent, that is the Ottoman resurgence under the revitalized Koprulu viziers that we made different videos on for the series on Vienna. These were incredibly powerful. They produced several crucial operations. Today we don't talk Vienna, we stop to Saint Gotthard and other clashes, but let's say it's a very important chapter, as you know. In 1663, you have the siege of Ersekuyvar, Nove Zamki Uyvar, ended with the Grand Vizier Fazil Ahmed Koprulu the Grand Vizier from 1661 and the central architect of his family's sweeping restoration of Ottoman administrative and military authority, capturing the fortress on September the 13th after the Austrians rejected peace terms. The city was promptly transformed into the seat of the new Uyvar Eyalet, significantly strengthening Ottoman control over Upper Hungary and providing a forward base for operations deeper into Habsburgic territory. The Köprülü were fiercely anti-Christian. They were pushing for no compromise whatsoever. The Sultan was ambivalent here. And in any case, there would be opportunities to exploit in this sense in an offensive way against the Habsburgs that had also emerged in a sort of not such a great shape from the 30 Years' War. Now, in June-July 1664, the siege of Novi Zrin showcased Ottoman siegecraft at its most relentless and destructive. Fazil Ahmed Köprülü's enormous army, estimated as always in the hundreds of thousands, probably again in the full complement of at least some tens of thousands of fighters, subjected Nicola Zrinke's modern fortress on the Mura River to weeks of continuous bombardment and systematic mining operations. Right? There's this giantism complex of the Ottomans, but they also have to, because it's the only way to overcome these defenses. In fact, when explosive charges finally collapsed the bastions, the outnumbered Croatian and German defenders were forced to withdraw. We are on July the 7th. The victorious Ottomans razed Novi Zrin completely to the ground, ensuring it could never again serve as a Habsburg forward position. The castle was never rebuilt, and its destruction symbolized the temporary Ottoman dominance along this stretch of the frontier. The campaign of 1664 reached its dramatic high point, however, at one of the most important battles in modern history that I don't know how can be for it to be still so unpopular. I discovered with horror that people have truly no clue about 17th century warfare in any significant sense, by even properly the scale and importance of these clashes. We're obviously talking about the 1664 dramatic high point of the Battle of Saint Gotthard, Maugersdorf, or the Saint Gotthard, etc. On August, it had different names, again, in the typical sort of multilinguistic nature of this frontier. We're on August the 1st of 1664, one of the most significant land engagements of the entire Ottoman-Habsburg confrontation, historically, and a defining moment that shattered illusions of Ottoman invincibility deep into Central Europe, although, it basically saved Vienna, because between this, as we'll say, Christian army and Vienna, there was nothing that could withstand the Ottoman onslaught this time, because the defenses were quite outdated by that point, and truly, this is what allows the 1683 siege to even be possible 20 years later. The Grand Vizier Ahmed Köprülü, commanding a formidable army that had already demonstrated its power in the capture of Novi Zrin, as we've seen, and the threat to Vienna, advanced aggressively toward the Habsburg capital itself. That was the objective. Austrian forces, under the brilliant and overwhelmingly pluridecorated imperial commander Raimondo Montecuccoli, supported by a multinational coalition including Austrian regulars, Hungarian hussars, German mercenaries, and contingents from various Holy Roman Empire states. There were, again, normally Germans, Italians, Frenchmen, you have Slavs, Magyars, and so on, positioned themselves to block the Ottoman thrust along the Rab River. The Battle of the Rab is yet another name, near the village of Maugersdorf, that again is Saint Gotthard in Hungarian. So again, that you have the entire array of names of this most famous battle that unfolded in a series of furious cavalry charges and infantry clashes across the rivers, fords, and bridges. It was actually a masterpiece, tactically wise. Montecuccoli's disciplined heavy cavalry and artillery exploited the terrain and Ottoman overextension, repeatedly breaking Köprülü's divided formations that were essentially crossing the Rab and trying to break the Christian center. And Montecuccoli managed to maintain in all this chaos, like the coordination of cavalry charges, infantry file fire, and so there is a very interesting display also of the new way of war that we were commenting on the other for the video on Scholar Gladiatory the other day, properly the transition from pike and shot to fundamentally linear tactics that will take another century before it would actually fully sort of put into definitional practice. But this was incredible because the Christians were much less, and they were, they were the bastions of themselves. There was no fortress here within except the Christian line. The Ottomans all sort of toughed in the center, and being overwhelmed by these Christian counterattacks, suffered heavy losses, particularly among the elite Janissary and Sipahi units, so the finest of their army, while the Austrians maintained cohesion and inflicted punishing casualties. It was extraordinary just because this army was so multinational, just to keep orders. There was a sort of military koine. If you look at the writings of Montecuccoli or Prince Eugene later, this mix of German, Italian, French. The soldiers roughly understood. It's a bit like, say, I don't know, the Roman legionnaires. Many people, also auxiliaries, had to learn Latin just to play along, and they just needed to know the orders, but they knew the training would have already conferred them with that psycho-technical capacity to obey, without understanding the full language for that matter. So it's an incredible testament, by the way, to European unity. Regardless of sort of the less than idyllic international situation in front of this Ottoman onslaught, and that's why we will continue looking at specifically at these topics soon, hopefully. Now, the defeat at Saint Gotthard forced Ahmed Koprulu into a rapid and disorderly retreat, abandoning any realistic prospect of reaching Vienna that was saved on that day, on that battlefield. All right. Because there was nothing but that Christian force between the Ottomans and undefended Vienna. This setback obviously inflicted, even before what happened 19 years later, one of the empire's most capable grand viziers, shattered Ottoman momentum at the very moment when a decisive trust seemed possible, compelling the Porte to seek terms. Montecuccoli was, again, one of the greatest commanders in military theory. I mean, he is really the cornerstone in military thinking between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. Historically, he informed an entire generation of great commanders, starting from Prince Eugene, for that matter. He, however, had no resources from the emperor to chase the Ottomans. So, as always, these tactical victories are not quite exploited because they cost too much and there are no means, financially speaking, to support a proper offensive. There is also certain Habsburgic, at this point, sort of conservatism about this issue. This is also, by the way, at the Battle of the Rab, the moment in which Montecuccoli, was a great veteran of also the 30 Years' War, capturing the Ottoman baggage in camp, evaluated the quality of Ottoman gunpowder, and he said that it was excellent. So showing that the Ottomans were not simply sort of technologically so inferior to the Westerners. Admittedly, after the 30 Years' War, there was an overproduction crisis. The Europeans sold a lot of unspent guns and ammo and powder, etc., to the Ottomans that also had lots of French, again, advisors, etc. But in general, the notion that simply, okay, well, the Westerners won because we're more technologically advanced, and as always, technology does not do that, and it's something much greater than that. And I made videos about the Peace of Vasvar that resulted out of Saint Gotthard, that was signed shortly after the battle, stabilizing the frontier on lines largely preserving the status quo ante, as a matter of fact, though it was widely viewed in Vienna and Buda as a disappointing compromise that failed to capitalize fully on the victory of Saint Gotthard, also because lots of people in Ottoman Hungary were starting to get fed up of the Turkish domination, and they were eyeing the Habsburgs, even though they didn't want to be too sort of oppressed by them in turn. The battle's psychological impact was profound. It demonstrated that Ottoman field armies, even under strong leadership, could be decisively checked in Central Europe. That was still accessible to them. I mean, Vienna, Warsaw, even, they could have been reached by the Ottoman. Vienna was, even by the Ottoman army, foreshadowing the dramatic reversals that would follow in the coming decades. All right. A brief mention to the Koprulu restoration. This was initiated by the father, as we've seen, Mehmed Koprulu as Grand Vizier from 1656 to 61, and continued by his son Fazil Hamed, breathing new vitality into the empire during its most precarious decades. Right? Through rigorous fiscal discipline, they balanced the budget by 1669, a sound precondition, as we were saying, also from the Christian side, it was a great problem in that sense, but the Ottomans could really fix certain things and get lots of resources. Drastically reducing, by the way, the size of the chronically mutinous household troops as well, easing the crushing tax burden on the poorest rural subject. There are a lot of very interesting tax, social, military reforms, restoring discipline and combat effectiveness to both the army and navy after the bloodletting, again, of Candia and Saint Gotthard, and recovered much of the prestige that had eroded under earlier weak administrations. Yet, even these impressive reforms could not overcome some of the more foundational imperial structural weaknesses. And so when you look at 1683, you realize that a great desperate attempt in grand style, right, of this still very powerful empire to achieve a result that could make it still sort of competitively relevant in the truly superpower sense of the word. And they were almost there, really. So much was settled at Vienna. Most critically, some say that the Ottoman military demonstrated a persistent reluctance to fully adopt and integrate the rapidly evolving gunpowder technologies. Again, this is not really true. Surely the improved field artillery, disciplined infantry volley fire, the sophisticated combined armed tactics of the West were not there in the Ottoman Empire. They couldn't really get it, right? Western Europeans and Central Europeans here were ever more homogeneous in that capacity. So the Ottomans could cope well. They still had symmetric capacity to crush the Westerns, but again, don't think that technology is as much as the center of that. Yet, that fighting style is also surely bringing some deficits from the Ottoman side, and it especially like highlighting some issues, as we were saying before, were socio-economical, moral, cultural. It's a bit like the same difference we highlighted between the West and the Byzantine War. I mean, the West was just structured in a completely different way. It was much more advanced from a quite long time in a deeper sense, even though still pre-industrial societies, you would think that the difference was so decisive at all, right? If anything, again, that there were comparable systems. Now, the Ottomans had once pioneered artillery development in the 15th, the early 16th centuries. We know that. We made multiple videos about it, in particular that arm. But by the mid-17th century, they lagged noticeably behind in certain things. This technological conservatism, compounded by the internal strains that had become evident after Suleiman the Magnificent's death, so chronic fiscal exhaustion, administrative corruption, over-reliance on irregular and plunder-dependent troops, and the gradual breakdown of the Timar system, was essentially the equivalent of the pronoyar, the sort of essentially the Ottoman way to feudalism, ensured that even the Koprulu's successful campaigns could not recapture the unstoppable momentum of the classical age of conquest. And so when we look at this timeline today, the wars of 1529 to 1664, think of how much had changed. In these, you see here, just a bit more than one century, all right? Concluded with the frontier stabilized rather than decisively shifted in either direction, setting the stage for the last great Ottoman offensive against Vienna in 1683 and the dramatic reversal of fortunes that would follow in its wake for the Ottomans. But tells so much about sort of the history of the art of war, international politics, the role of the Ottomans in European history, and the the courageous spirit of the Crusades that was still very well alive in the heart of the Europeans. And all this were, by the way, incredibly well coordinated by the papacy that made an enormous effort and spent an incredibly large amount of money to successfully, in fact, back those who were about to fall. Right here, all these battles where you just imagine Malta, obviously without one another it would have not existed, but Malta, Lepanto, and even those were actually lost by the Christians. Think about Candia. And just think about the consequences of Saint Gotthard. Nobody really thinks too much about this locally. They're very felt, but in pop culture, they should be properly reappreciated in a deeper sense. And this is also why I'm making these videos and such long ones, because without the stories, I think we can't recover properly the sense of a united Europe, because this theme in particular is one of actual European cooperation, even when somebody rose backwards from the within. And so it's so morally uplifting, it's so inspiring and romantic. It's this time of sort of showing you how slightly less developed parts of Europe were capable of sort of fighting against the greater threat. And succeeding where others were just minding their own business in many ways. So the video is extremely long in and of itself, therefore I stop it here. But again, everything I left out here is intentionally so, because there's definitely way too much here to really cover in any profitable, meaningful sense for a single video. But we really needed to look at this middle video, the one about Francis I. It's sort of relatively small. The one about, well, how much? Oh no, it was actually more than 2 hours, so it's more or less like that. We will make another 2 hours long video, hopefully, later on about this, the remaining part. And so you understand how it's a long way from the later Middle Ages to almost the contemporary era. But yeah, and I stop it here because I have some technical means for which I can't upload, can't edit videos that are longer than, say, 2 hours and a half or something. Otherwise, the audio track will be cut here. For today, however, therefore, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.